The world's ancient monuments point to the presence of a history of humanity beyond anything that's taught in conventional academia. Researchers such as Graham Hancock, the late John Anthony West, Robert Schoch, Richard Casaro, and many others have found overwhelming evidence which points to connections in the architecture and design and even the mathematical layout of the world's ancient monuments. Connections, for example, between the numbers found in the ratios of the design of the pyramids of ancient Egypt and the pyramids of Central America, or between the iconography used in statues found in cultures that conventional history says could not possibly be connected. The archaeological evidence makes an extremely compelling and, I would say, even conclusive argument that the conventional timeline of ancient human history is deeply flawed and in need of radical revision. My own research into humanity's ancient mythology, which builds on the research of others in previous centuries, shows that in addition to the archaeological evidence, there is an entire body of mythological evidence, which also makes a compelling and, I would argue, conclusive case that the conventional academic models are deeply flawed and in need of radical revision. The world's ancient myths contain astonishing parallels. That much is already known and is the subject of university courses on comparative mythology or theories about the collective unconscious and so forth. But far beyond the superficial comparisons, the world's ancient myths can all be shown to be using the very same system of celestial metaphor, to be using, so to speak, the same architectural plans, the same blueprints. This system uses the constellations of the night sky and turns them into spiritual stories or myths, referencing very specific features of those constellations. Virtually every story in the Bible, for example, can be shown to be referring to constellations, built on a blueprint of constellations. And the same can be said for the various familiar myths of ancient Greece, such as the labors of Heracles or Hercules, or the adventures of Odysseus, and all the rest. And the same can be said for the myths of ancient Egypt and ancient India, ancient Mesopotamia, and so on around the world, including the sacred traditions and myths of Africa, the cultures of Africa, the cultures of the Americas, and of the islands of the Pacific, of the continent of Australia, and of ancient China and ancient Japan, and the Norse in extreme northern Europe. The connections go far beyond superficial similarities between the stories or the characters, down to the very framework that the myths are built upon, the very structure, the blueprint, the architecture. They're all using a common framework, a framework of constellations. This evidence, which I will briefly demonstrate in this video, and which I've written about in several books and over 1,000 blog posts and dozens of other videos, constitutes an additional body of evidence alongside the archaeological evidence in the pyramids and other ancient physical structures and monuments. A body of evidence which points to, both bodies of evidence, in fact, point towards the existence of a now forgotten ancient culture predating any of the most ancient cultures known to conventional history. Now let's take a look. One influential examination of the evidence that the ancient myths have deep connections to the celestial cycles is the encyclopedic text entitled Hamlet's Mill, published in 1969 and written by two professors, Herta von Decken, and Giorgio de Santillana. They do not appear to have deciphered all of the mythal references to specific constellations, but they make some connections, one of them being their interpretation of the story of Samson's use of a jawbone of an ass as a weapon for slaying 1,000 of his enemies, recorded in Judges chapter 15. The authors of Hamlet's Mill argue, correctly I think, that the jawbone corresponds to the V-shaped Hyades in Taurus. Judges 15, verse 15, says that Samson found a new, literally the word is a moist, jawbone of an ass, and put forth his hand and took it, and slew 1,000 of his enemies therewith. Here we see the constellation Orion, which is reaching forth its hand towards the head of the constellation Taurus. The V shape here is a formation of stars called the Hyades, whose very name implies water or moisture, as the authors of Hamlet's Mill point out. The Hyades are shaped like a V in the night sky, and if you feel your own jawbone, or look at the jawbone of a donkey or many other animals, you'll note that it is also V-shaped. Thus, the Hyades resemble a jawbone. Now, what's very intriguing is that the text calls this the jawbone of an ass, even though the Hyades are in the constellation Taurus, the bull. The constellation has 2 long horns. In front of the V-shaped Hyades, there are 2 other stars that make the horns of Taurus. But instead of envisioning them as horns, it's also possible to envision them as the long ears of an ass. And we have confirmation in other myths that the constellation Taurus was sometimes envisioned as an ass instead of as a bull. For instance, we find the story of Balaam and the ass, in which the prophet Balaam is riding a female donkey, and Balaam's donkey stops in the way because an angel is blocking her path. The donkey even crushes Balaam's foot against a wall instead of going forward. Balaam does not see the angel, and he begins to beat the donkey, and the donkey is granted the power of speech and asks Balaam, why is he beating her? Then the angel is revealed to Balaam. As I've explained in previous examinations of this story in blog posts and other videos, the donkey or ass in this story is once again the constellation Taurus, envisioned as a long-eared ass instead of as a bull. And this time, the constellation Perseus, which is directly above Taurus, is the one who's riding on the donkey, unlike Samson, who's reaching out his hand to take the jawbone instead. You can see that Perseus, in fact, appears to have his feet twisted. The constellation Perseus, the outline of Perseus, has a twisted foot, just like Balaam in the story. This goes a long way towards confirming the hypothesis that Taurus is sometimes envisioned as an ass instead of a bull, and that the jawbone that Samson takes is indeed the Hyades in Taurus. The angel in the story of Balaam, by the way, is the constellation Andromeda, who plays the role of an angel in some other ancient sacred stories as well, not just in the Bible, but in other myths around the world. Now that we've confirmed that the identification of the jawbone of the ass is the constellation Taurus, we can return to our examination of the Samson story and go to a different episode where Samson is going to take on the role of a different constellation. He's going to correspond to a different constellation, not to Orion next to Taurus. The most well-known part of the Samson myth, of course, is the episode in which Samson's hair is shorn off at the direction of Delilah after he falls asleep in her lap. Here's a painting from 1844 depicting that episode in which we see Samson asleep in Delilah's lap. What's extremely interesting about this painting, and aspect of this painting that is shared with many other depictions of this same episode down through the centuries, even earlier than this one, is the fact that the artist has depicted Samson and the other figures in this story in ways that correspond to specific constellations, most of them zodiac constellations. Samson, for example, is depicted at the angle which is appropriate to the constellation Scorpio in the night sky. The outline of Samson himself resembles the outline of Scorpio in the sky. One of Samson's feet, you can see one foot is hooked over the ankle of the other leg, and his legs form a shape corresponding to the shape of the lower half, the stinger part of the scorpion in the night sky. Here's a star chart showing the constellation Scorpio, and you can see how the artist in the Samson picture has incorporated the sinuous form of Scorpio into his painting of Samson. Now, Samson in the painting is lying on the lap of Delilah, just like in the text. The text says that that's what Samson is doing. And Delilah has her knees apart in this painting. And in the night sky, Scorpio is located directly below the constellation Ophiuchus, whose legs are similarly apart, and Scorpio's upper body can be imagined to be resting between them, very much like the outline of Samson in the painting, resting on the lap of Delilah. In the painting, the person who's coming to shear off Samson's hair is depicted as a woman who's wearing a long dress reaching down to her feet and holding out her shears in front of her in a distinctive manner. This figure in the painting can be seen to closely correspond to the constellation Sagittarius. Note that the artist has even included a quiver of arrows right here, just in case we're not perfectly clear that the painting is referring to Sagittarius with this figure. The constellation Sagittarius in the sky is an archer. The name of the constellation itself comes from the Latin word for an arrow, sagitta. Here is the constellation Sagittarius in the night sky, outlined in yellow, and you can see how the bow of the constellation could instead be envisioned as the shears reaching out towards Samson, preparing to give him his famous haircut. And just in case anyone objects that this artist is incorporating aspects of constellations into the painting, objects to that argument and says, no, that's just coincidence. The artist has included also this low bench with two legs that Samson's resting upon. You see how Samson is leaning on this bench with two legs. And we saw that Samson is depicted in the posture of the constellation Scorpio. Well, immediately in front of Scorpio in the night sky is the zodiac constellation of Libra, the balance or the scales. And the outline of Libra corresponds very closely to the outline of that bench in front of Samson. The bench is positioned in the correct place to represent Libra in the painting relative to Samson, if Samson corresponds to Scorpio, which there's enough detail in this painting to confirm that Samson in this particular episode corresponds to Scorpio. Note that the artist has even included an ivy-colored pillar rising up next to Delilah. See that pillar? This pillar in the painting corresponds to the position of the column of the Milky Way itself, which rises up next to the constellation Ophiuchus. We've argued that Ophiuchus corresponds to Delilah in this episode. So these correspondences go well beyond coincidence. They indicate that the artist was deliberately incorporating celestial references into his artwork. Either that, or he was taught to incorporate these celestial references without knowing that they're pointing to constellations in the sky, without knowing what they actually signified. That's the other possibility. But they represent celestial figures. Whether the artist knew that or not the artists were taught these conventions, because these conventions go down through the centuries for various scenes. Of course, this artist was working in the first half of the 19th century, well after the end of antiquity. But there's every indication that the ancient story itself has to do with the constellations in this part of the night sky, the constellations which, in fact, are located at the very lowest part of the annual cycle. The sun is passing through Sagittarius and Scorpio right at the time of the winter solstice, when the sun's rays are diminished in much the same way that the locks of Samson are sheared off before they begin to grow back. And in case anyone objects, well, this painting is from the modern era, which it is, it's from the modern era, and can't be used as evidence for a connection between ancient texts and constellations, I will now point out that these kinds of artistic references to the constellations go back for centuries and even for millennia, back to ancient times. We're going to look at another episode from the mythology, this time of ancient Greece, from the Odyssey. And the Odyssey, in fact, is from a time many centuries prior to the time that we call the classical period of ancient Greece. In that story, in the Odyssey, Odysseus, the figure of Odysseus, the character of Odysseus, he's a warrior who went off to the Trojan War. He's trying to return home. And when he finally gets back, he discovers that over 100 violent suitors have camped out in his house, scheming to get his wife to marry one of them. That's why they're called suitors. They're pursuing his wife. And when he finally gets back, his house is overrun with these violent men who are camped out in his house, scheming to marry his wife and also plotting to kill Odysseus' son, Telemachus. So, after a period of planning and preparation, the wily Odysseus has to come up with a plan. Then Odysseus and Telemachus finally slay the suitors in the banquet hall. And this scene was depicted in ancient artwork, including on this ancient wine cup seen at the bottom of this set of drawings. The artwork on this wine cup wraps all the way around the cup. So the unwrapped depiction of the entire scene is shown above the drawing of the wine cup itself. It's kind of arched because it wraps around the wine cup. What's very noteworthy is the fact that this episode and this artistic depiction are based on the very same constellations that we just saw forming the foundation for the episode in which Samson's hair was shorn off. But this time, the same constellations are taking on different characters. They're taking on different forms in a different ancient sacred story. Same blueprints, same framework, different building. On the far left of the depiction, we see Odysseus holding out a bow at the same level that the constellation Sagittarius in the night sky is holding out its bow. In this scene, Odysseus corresponds to the constellation Sagittarius. And across from Odysseus, where he's pointing his bow, we see one of the suitors who's trying to get away. He already has one arrow sticking out of his back or his ribs. Notice that the angle of his body indicates that he, this suitor, like Samson in the previous artwork, corresponds to the constellation Scorpio. Look how his rear foot corresponds to the stinger tail of the constellation. On the couch behind the Scorpio figure, we see another suitor. This one sitting up out of a recumbent position with his arm extended there. This figure actually corresponds to the constellation Virgo in the night sky. That extended arm is a distinctive feature of the constellation Virgo, shows up in many myths with figures based on this important constellation. Let's take a look at the constellations now and the stars corresponding to these figures that we've identified in the artwork. Can you see how Odysseus corresponds to Sagittarius, pointing its bow directly towards Scorpio in the sky, just as Odysseus in the ancient artwork points the bow towards a suitor whose outline in the artwork matches that of Scorpio in the sky? And can you see how the outline of Virgo a constellation which appears to be somewhat recumbent as she crosses the night sky, but which has a distinctive outstretched arm, corresponds to the suitor on the couch. Now, in between Scorpio and Virgo in the sky is the zodiac constellation of Libra. We saw Libra represented in the previous artwork with Samson and Delilah. This ancient cup depicting the suitor slaying scene also includes a Libra figure. In this case, the suitor who's crouching between the Scorpio figure and the Virgo figure and holding up a low table to try and block arrows. It's kind of like a coffee table. This table reference in the artwork is very similar to the low two-legged bench in the much later depiction of Samson and Delilah that we looked at. And finally, we saw that in the Samson and Delilah artwork, there was even a Milky Way figure, a column, artwork, a column with ivy on it depicting the Milky Way. Well, in this artwork on the ancient cup from ancient Greece showing Odysseus slaying the suitors, we also have an artistic depiction of the Milky Way in the appropriate location. The brightest part of the Milky Way rises up between Sagittarius and Scorpio, and on this ancient cup, in between Odysseus, who corresponds to Sagittarius, and that suitor, the closest suitor with the arrow already sticking out of him, who corresponds to Scorpio, we have this ornate flower-like design in the precise location that corresponds to the Milky Way in the sky. Thus, we can conclude that the ancient artists put this detail in as an indication of the location of the Milky Way, and that those other constellations, those other figures correspond to the constellations that I'm arguing here, the zodiac constellations of Sagittarius, Scorpio, Libra, and Virgo. The parallels between these two episodes, one from the scriptures of the Old Testament, one from the Odyssey of very ancient Greece, are quite striking. They show that the underlying framework of these two very different stories is actually the same constellations. It's composed of the same constellations in the same part of the sky. And literally hundreds of other examples from cultures found on every inhabited continent around our globe and all the islands could be added to these few examples mentioned here to show that the myths from around the world are using a common framework, a common celestial structure. The myths of the world, in contradiction to the accepted conventional historical paradigm, are using the same system, the very same heavenly blueprints based on the constellations in the night sky and those celestial cycles which the constellations indicate to us. That's all part of it. The constellations indicate the celestial cycles along with the motions of the sun, the moon, and the visible planets. And that's what these myths are talking about. And they're using the same framework. And I would argue they're conveying the same message, even though they're superficially different with some similarities. The structure underneath is the same. So the myths of the world constitute a compelling body of evidence, which, alongside the evidence from the ancient monuments around the world, together argue very strongly that the conventional timeline of human history is wrong and needs to be corrected. It appears very likely that this common worldwide mythological architecture comes from some extremely ancient common source, a source which predates any of the most ancient civilizations we know about, since those ancient civilizations also have myths that are using this same system as well. The blueprints of the myths are in the stars, and intriguingly enough, many researchers have also shown that the blueprints of many of the world's ancient monuments and megalithic structures are in the stars as well. Together, they both point to aspects of our ancient past which are completely overlooked or denied by conventional academia, and which have tremendous implications for human history and for our lives today.